The house was alive with the warmth of family. Laughter echoed through the spacious living room, blending with the soft clinking of glasses and the scent of freshly baked goods. It was New Year's Eve, and for the Reynolds family, this evening held the promise of a fresh start, one filled with joy, love, and memories. In the kitchen, Marissa Reynolds, a no-nonsense mother with a heart of gold, bustled around preparing snacks and drinks for the evening's guests. She had always prided herself on being the glue that held the family together, and tonight was no exception. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, keeping a careful watch over her 3 children as they gathered with cousins and friends. The house, tucked away on the outskirts of town, felt like their fortress. Safe, secluded, and full of life. Her husband, Marcus Reynolds, relaxed in the living room with his older brother, Greg. As a former police officer turned private security consultant, Marcus had a reputation for being calm under pressure. He leaned back in his armchair, a glass of whiskey in hand, listening to Greg talk about the challenges of managing his new business. The 2 men laughed easily, the kind of brotherly bond that made time slip away unnoticed. In the corner, the youngest of the Reynolds children, Aaliyah, and her cousin Amir played a game of Monopoly. Aaliyah, the shy yet clever 14-year-old, would sometimes win in ways that frustrated her older brother, Jaden. At 17, Jaden was already developing a budding interest in becoming a detective, and tonight, like many nights before, he observed the world with a keen eye. He watched his sister's hand move across the game board with a sharp focus that only seemed to grow as the evening continued. As the clock in the hallway ticked closer to midnight, Marissa called everyone to gather in the living room for the traditional New Year's toast. The house was full of energy. Greg cracked a joke that had everyone in stitches, and Marcus raised his glass with a smirk. Aaliyah smiled shyly as her mother guided her to the center of the room, urging her to stand tall. The older kids rolled their eyes, but the family's tradition of starting the year with a moment of togetherness felt important, more so now than ever. Outside, the cold December wind howled against the windows. The chill of the night couldn't penetrate the warmth inside, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing could ever threaten this sanctuary of theirs. The world outside was distant, irrelevant. Their lives, their laughter, their little routines, they all felt like something that could never be interrupted. Yet, all of that calmness was an illusion. While the family celebrated, a pair of dark figures stood hidden across the street in the shadows of the trees. They weren't concerned with the warmth or the joy inside the Reynolds home. Their attention was fixed on the house, eyes narrowed in the darkness, watching the front door as the sound of music and laughter carried on the wind. The plan was simple: wait for the moment of vulnerability. The family would be caught off guard. The best targets were those who felt safe. Those who believed nothing could touch them. It was in this fragile moment of bliss that the storm began to gather, unseen and inevitable. The night was about to change. The peaceful celebration that had filled the house with warmth would soon be shattered by an intrusion that none of them had seen coming. And when the first knock on the door came, everything would fall apart. The clock struck just past midnight, signaling the official start of the new year. As the cheers and toasts echoed through the living room, Marissa, Marcus, and the children shared a moment of joy, unaware that the minutes ahead would bring their world crashing down. The atmosphere inside the house was one of light-hearted celebration. Marissa stood by the kitchen doorway, holding a glass of champagne as she raised it toward her family. To a new year, new possibilities, she toasted, her voice warm and confident, even as her mind stayed alert to the needs of the evening. The laughter that filled the air was suddenly interrupted by a loud, unexpected knock on the front door. It echoed through the house with a strange urgency. For a moment, no one moved. The music continued to play in the background, a strange contrast to the oddness of the moment. Who could that be? Greg muttered, his voice laced with confusion. He glanced toward Marcus, who had already stood up, his senses alert. Marissa frowned and started toward the door, her hand instinctively resting on her phone. "It's probably just some of the neighbors from down the street," she said, trying to sound reassuring. But Marcus' brow furrowed as he watched her approach the door. Something about the knock didn't feel right. The rhythm was too deliberate, too timed. "Stay here, Marissa," Marcus said, his voice low but commanding. He'd dealt with enough situations in his career to know when something wasn't right. As Marissa turned to respond, another knock sounded, this time louder and more forceful. It was followed by a series of rapid, sharp thuds that shook the door. Aaliyah, who had been standing near the staircase, froze. "Mom, I don't like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible as her eyes locked on the door. "Whoever it is, they can't just keep knocking like that," Jaden said, his voice tinged with suspicion. His instincts had always been sharp, even for someone so young. He was already moving toward the door, unaware that his footsteps were setting the tone for what would come next. Marcus rushed to intercept his son, his protective instincts kicking in. "Jaden, get back," he commanded, but before anyone could react further, the door was violently slammed open. The suddenness of the crash sent Marissa stumbling back, knocking over a vase in the process. The smell of broken glass mixed with the rising tension in the room as two masked figures barged into the house. They were tall, dark figures, their faces obscured by ski masks, their clothes dark and unassuming. The first intruder moved quickly, pushing Marissa aside as he reached for her phone. "Get down," he barked, his voice gruff with authority. His eyes scanned the room like a predator, a coldness in his gaze that sent chills down everyone's spines. The second intruder was right behind him, blocking the hallway, a large bag slung across his shoulder. He held a gun, and the sight of it froze everyone in place. "What do you want?" Greg demanded, his voice rising with anger and disbelief. "This is a private home. You need to leave." The intruder with the gun aimed it straight at Greg's chest, his hand steady as he spoke. "This is a robbery. Now, stay down and no one gets hurt." The silence that followed felt suffocating. It was as though time had slowed, and all the energy that had once filled the room was sucked out in an instant. Marcus looked at Marissa, his mind racing. The invaders had taken control of the house within seconds. The sound of the gunshot that had pierced the air was the one thing they had been waiting for, a warning shot that told them this wasn't a negotiation. Aaliyah, still frozen in shock, whispered, "They know we're here. They know everything." Her words sent a wave of panic through the family, but there was no time to process them. Marcus was the first to act, lunging at the nearest intruder. He grabbed the man by the wrist, trying to disarm him. The fight that ensued was quick but intense. The second intruder rushed in, knocking Marcus aside with a brutal shove. Greg lunged to help, but the intruder with the gun swung it toward him. "Move another inch, and I'll shoot," the man shouted. Panic spread like wildfire as the family realized just how much danger they were in. The laughter and warmth that had filled the house only moments before now felt like a distant memory. The invaders had come for something more than just money, this was a carefully planned attack. And they weren't leaving without getting what they wanted. The living room, once full of warmth and laughter, was now a battlefield. The intruders moved like seasoned predators, their eyes scanning every corner of the house as they ordered everyone to stay down on the floor. The gun in the hands of the taller intruder gleamed under the dim light, and the second intruder, more silent and ominous, quickly began stuffing valuables into the large bag. Marcus, heart racing, his thoughts clouded with both fear and determination, could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew the fight for survival wasn't just about physical strength anymore, it was about outsmarting these men, outlasting them. "Get the kids in the basement." "Now," Marcus muttered under his breath to Marissa, his voice low but firm. She hesitated for just a moment, torn between keeping her family together and doing whatever she could to protect them. But as the intruder's voice rang out again, commanding everyone to stay still, the reality of the situation hit her like a wave. Marissa grabbed Aaliyah's and Jaden's hands, pulling them toward the basement stairs, whispering instructions under her breath. "Stay quiet. Do exactly what I say. Don't make a sound. The children, their faces pale and filled with fear, nodded and followed her lead. They were quick, not wasting a second. Greg stayed behind, eyes locked on the intruders, his body tense. He had to protect them, even if it meant confronting these men head-on. His mind raced as he analyzed their every movement, looking for a weakness, an opportunity to turn the tide. The intruder with the gun focused on Marcus, who was standing resolute, still trying to come up with a plan. "What do you want?" Marcus asked again, his voice steady despite the fear threatening to rise within him. The taller intruder sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Your money, your valuables, and we want to make sure you understand something." He paused, walking closer to Marcus, his finger brushing against the gun's trigger. "We don't take kindly to resistance." Marcus clenched his fists. He could hear his heart in his throat, but he refused to show fear. The longer they stayed in control, the more likely it was they would win. They had to take action. Greg moved first. As the second intruder turned his attention toward Marissa's movements, he took the opportunity to charge at the man with the gun. He lunged for his arm, knocking it out of line with his chest. The bullet fired but missed. For a moment, there was nothing but chaos. The room filled with the sounds of struggle, of heavy breaths and the frantic scuffling of feet. Marcus took advantage of the distraction, tackling the first intruder to the ground. His years of training had prepared him for moments like this. He didn't hesitate. He twisted the man's arm, forcing the gun out of his grip. The intruder let out a string of curses but didn't stop fighting back. With the gun now out of his hands, Marcus and the man exchanged blows, each one more desperate than the last. The intruder, though more experienced in violent encounters, was slower and more reckless than Marcus had anticipated. He was fueled by adrenaline, but Marcus was driven by something deeper, his family's safety. "Get off of me," the intruder shouted as he kicked Marcus in the chest. Marcus stumbled but quickly regained his footing, charging back at the man. Meanwhile, Greg was doing everything in his power to wrestle the other intruder into submission. He managed to get a hold of the man's wrist, locking him in a painful arm lock. The intruder grunted, attempting to break free, but Greg held his ground, applying more pressure. The intruder kicked and struggled, trying to land blows, but Greg was determined. His arms burned with the effort, but he wouldn't let go. Not now. Not when his family needed him the most. Marissa and the children were safely hidden in the basement, but the sound of the struggle above sent waves of dread through them. Aaliyah clutched her mother's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't just stay here," Aaliyah whispered. "We have to help them." Marissa's eyes flashed with panic, but she quickly composed herself. "We're staying put for now. If we go up there, we risk everything. We can't take chances." The sounds of the fight above them intensified, the loud crashes of furniture being overturned and the heavy footsteps of the intruders as they struggled. It felt like time itself had frozen. Upstairs, Marcus and Greg were fighting for their lives. The balance of power shifted again when Marcus finally managed to land a heavy punch to the face of the first intruder, sending him reeling back. The intruder's mask slipped for a split second, revealing a pair of bloodshot eyes filled with rage and fear. "Please, stop. Please," the man screamed, scrambling to get away. Marcus didn't let up. His fists landed again and again, until the man's body went limp, the fight finally drained from him. With the first intruder subdued, Marcus quickly moved toward Greg. But the second intruder wasn't done yet. The struggle continued, but now they had the upper hand. The family had managed to disarm both invaders, and now they were in control. The basement door opened, and Marissa emerged, followed by Aaliyah and Jaden, their faces drawn but determined. They knew the fight wasn't over yet, but the family had proven that they weren't going down without a fight. The house felt eerily quiet after the final crash. The intruders were immobilized, their weapons taken from them, but the atmosphere was charged with tension. Marcus, breathing heavily, stood over the still bodies, his mind racing, heart pounding. They had gained the upper hand, but at what cost? The room was a mess. Furniture was upturned, chairs shattered against the walls, and glass from broken picture frames littered the floor like confetti from a nightmare. Greg moved to the window, his eyes scanning the driveway for signs of any more intruders or vehicles. He had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. "I don't trust this," Greg muttered, peering into the night. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "We need to be ready for anything." Marissa stepped forward cautiously, her eyes still wide with fear but determined to keep the family together. She checked on the children first, Aaliyah, who clung to her side, and Jaden, who looked like he was holding back tears. "They're okay," she said, her voice a little steadier now. "But we need to figure out what's going on here." Marcus nodded, his jaw set. "Yeah, but we don't know what we're up against. Let's tie them up and call the police." Greg, moving back toward the intruders, began to drag the first one into the living room, looping the man's hands behind his back with whatever ropes they could find. Marcus did the same with the second. As he worked, his mind kept returning to a nagging thought: how did they know so much about his family? "Something isn't right," Marcus said, the words heavy with suspicion. "These guys knew exactly where we were, what we had, they knew too much. This wasn't just a random robbery." Marissa swallowed hard, her eyes flicking toward the intruders. "What do you mean? What did they say?" Marcus glanced at Greg, who had just finished tying the second intruder up. "They mentioned our stuff, our house. They even knew about the kids being upstairs in the basement." He shook his head, his brow furrowing. "This feels personal." Before either of them could respond, one of the intruders stirred. His eyes shot open, and he let out a low growl as he tested the ropes binding him. The man was conscious, just barely, but enough to be dangerous. "You're not getting away with this," Marcus snapped, stepping forward to face him. "Who sent you?" The intruder's lips curled into a twisted grin. "You think we're the only ones?" he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "This was just the beginning. They know you. They're coming for you." Marissa froze, fear creeping up her spine like icy fingers. "Who? Who's coming for us?" The intruder let out a hoarse laugh, blood trickling from his lip as he managed to sit up slightly. "Your husband, your father, you really think you're safe in here?" He coughed and then spat on the floor, his expression darkening. "You'll be dead before the night's over." Marcus clenched his fists, the words searing through him like fire. He didn't know who the intruder was referring to, but his gut twisted. There was something far more sinister at play than simple theft. Greg, visibly shaken but trying to maintain control, grabbed the man's collar and shook him. "What do you know? Who's behind this?" The intruder's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. There's a whole network, people you crossed, they never forget." "Tell me," Greg demanded, shaking him harder. But the intruder had no more answers. Instead, his gaze darted to the front door, his body suddenly going rigid. A flash of recognition passed over his face. "Too late," the man murmured, his voice low and trembling. "They're already here." A heavy thud sounded from the direction of the door, followed by a series of muffled voices. Marcus's stomach dropped. Someone was outside, someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. "We have to move. Now!" Marcus shouted, urgency cutting through his voice. Marissa immediately ushered the children into the nearest room, locking the door behind them. Greg moved to the windows, peeking through the blinds, but there was nothing but darkness beyond. The dread inside him grew. Marcus grabbed his phone and dialed 911. His hands were shaking as he waited for the operator to pick up. The tension in the room was unbearable. 911, what's your emergency?" "We've been attacked," Marcus said quickly. "We need police. Now." Stay on the line, sir. Can you confirm your address?